Hello, my name is Nontsikelelo Nzula. This is yet another What If We Think Differently podcast. Welcome if you've never joined us before. Tendai, it's good to see you. Welcome back.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a long time.
It's been a long time. How are you feeling?
A bit nervous. I've not been doing this in a while, but yeah, so I'm glad we're back doing this. Thank you very much.
No need to be nervous. We're just having a conversation today. So today we are tackling the topic of philanthropy. What is it? Where did it come from? What does it mean for us? So as we start on our journey today, Tendai, what is philanthropy? What kind of an animal is that?
Okay, so it's a bit of a big word and very few people use it. So you find that it's mostly used maybe by academics and specialists in the field. But literally what it means is human love, or the love for humanity, derived from the Greek, and it's been in existence for years. And it is said that those are the codes that define us as humanity. It's a universal feeling, universal approach, universal practice of being concerned about others. Yeah.
So with that being said, I know this might sound a little silly. When I was younger, I think the first time I came across the word philanthropy was I picked up a magazine, I think it was Destiny magazine, and I read about this, affluent lady, and they described her as a philanthropist. So the next time I met someone, they were like, oh, so Nancy, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I was like, I want to be a philanthropist. So with saying that, how do we define a philanthropist? Does it mean if I give someone money on the street or if I give in my church, does that make me a philanthropist?
Yeah. I think that's what we're going to discuss throughout this series, the second season of What If. I think we're going to be looking at what does it mean to be a philanthropist? What does it mean to be engaged in philanthropy? So normally, philanthropist has been a term that has been reserved for the rich who give to the poor.
Right.
So we'll try to walk around that concept a bit and try to broaden it beyond just the acts of giving done by the rich, but to try to say who else gives, how else do they give, etc. So I think to get us started, I would say in many African contexts or even globally, we find that we're on the one hand recipients of philanthropy, but when on the other hand philanthropists in different measures, different sizes, but we are all part of humanity and we all love each other. So I keep on going back to the issue around loving humanity or human love.
Right. So of late, staying around about the 2000s, this millennium, there has been a growing school of thought around African philanthropy. Could you just tell us what the difference is between African philanthropy and global philanthropy as we know it?
Oh, that's a big one. So we began to notice that literature, universal literature or global literature, when it was discussing the subject of philanthropy, it was narrowly framing it around what the rich were doing, the high net worth individuals, high net worth corporations. So whenever you talk about philanthropy, it's maybe the billionaires, the names of billionaires that come into your head.
The high net worth
high net worth, yeah. And these were mostly located in the global north, and their giving was towards us in the global south. So that was what we knew as philanthropy. But there emerged a new generation of scholars who began to challenge that. And they were challenging it from a very nuanced perspective to say, if you really look at cultures, both African, Asian, and Latin American, they're actually established around what we loosely call as Ubuntu. I am because you are. This recognition that your existence depends on others and their existence depends on you as well. So that interdependence. And this generation of scholars began to say that is the core of what we mean by philanthropy, because that is what defines the love for humanity. So when we began to do that, we began to say, look, when we do this and we're going into global meetings, the pushback is not to say Africans are not just recipients of global philanthropy. Africans are actually producing philanthropy and aiding their societies. So we began to say, maybe we need to code name this, to say, what name do we give to this? Because if we just keep it within the broad field of philanthropy, the metrics that were being used to discuss global philanthropy were just about dollars,
right.
How much money has been given. But for us, we're beginning to say philanthropy is beyond money. It is the giving of time, giving of skills, volunteering of this, the networks that are established. So over time, it emerged as a field that we then called African philanthropy, as an attempt to separate it from global philanthropy, to say there is maybe a sub-strand within what you are calling philanthropy, which you call African philanthropy. So we began to talk about the things that we do within African communities. And given the fact that more than half of our people in Africa are living in rural areas, so we're informed a lot by the norms of social organization that are in the rural areas in terms of how we then begin to talk about the philanthropy that we see. So the challenge was always to say, you guys are not measuring this, you guys are not quantifying it, etc., etc. But through thick descriptions, case studies, etc., we began to highlight some of these forms of philanthropy. And we began to say, in instances of disaster, the first responders are mostly the community before outsiders come in.
Right. With that being said, I want to talk about the characteristics that are unique to African philanthropy.
Okay.
And then we're also going to delve a little into, I know there's challenges around finding a unified definition of what it is. So let's tackle the characteristics that are unique to African giving.
So African giving, I would say, in my studies, I note maybe 3 or 4 strands. I would say, so there's the giving that is done by Africa's billionaires. We have a billionaire class, a millionaire class. So since the turn of the century, many magazines, including The Economist, noted that there's something happening on the continent, because prior to that, in 2003, Africa had been named the hopeless continent. Fast forward 10 years later, Africa is now named Africa Rising, because they begin to see double-digit growth in terms of GDP. But that double-digit growth is also associated with the emergence of a new phenomenon. African billionaires, the billionaire class, concentrated in Nigeria, in Kenya, in North Africa, in Egypt, in Tunisia, and also in other countries, in Tanzania, 1 or 2 in Zimbabwe, and in South Africa, etc. But it is these high net worth individuals and their high net worth corporations they establish that begin to establish foundations in their names, in the names of their corporates, etc., and they actually engage in giving. So we begin to say, oh, Africans are coming off edge, they are beginning to give. But the limitation with that side of giving, it mimics to the letter what we see in the global north.
Right.
So that's one strand. Then there's a second strand where philanthropy practitioners, those who've been working in global foundations, begin to say, no, we need institutions on the continent that have an understanding of the continent itself, so that, because at that moment the complaint was to say that donors, philanthropy foundations, and official development aid have a misunderstanding of what it will take to transform Africa. So the argument was, we need more Africans on the table, we need more African-led organizations. So it led to the emergence of what you may call intermediaries. These were organizations that were set up by specialists in the space of managing foundations, managing philanthropy flows, etc. The reason they were set up was to make sure that they can get big grants, because the argument that was being given was to say there are very few African organizations that can handle large grants. So now, when these organizations that are called intermediary organizations came up, they could now say, we've got the capacity to handle $10 million, and we'll distribute it to smaller organizations spread across the continent. So they emerged another layer in philanthropy that we call intermediary foundations. They didn't have resources of their own, but they went out and they aggregated resources and began to spread. So that's the second part. Then the third part is perhaps the most longest running tradition and custom of what you may call horizontal giving, when Africans or communities come together and they support each other. Right. They support each other. I always say there are 3 stages in economic life of human beings. There's production, there's accumulation and distribution, then there's welfare. So at all stages, those stages are actually informed by what you may call broadly African philanthropy, the solidarity that is established. Again, when we go further, we'll raise the contentions around this to say, do we also call this philanthropy? Because that's the challenge, because men are saying, but you're actually just mobilizing resources, maybe in a savings pool. What's philanthropic about it? But we begin to say that for us to understand Africa is to understand how communitarian they are and how they use collective platforms to give, to receive, etc. So we see that as the third tier, because, like I said earlier, those community-based organizations, in the event of problems, challenges in the community, they are always the first ones to respond. compared, say, NGOs or INGOs and philanthropy foundations. Those can come a week or so later. But the ones that are existing within communities are the ones that sort of respond first.
So would we then kind of define these, put them in boxes? I don't know if that would make it proper to say there is institutional giving, which I would tag as formal, and then there is informal giving when you talk about the communities and they're the first responders to crisis.
Yeah.
Is that correct to put them in those classes, or no, not so much?
No, it's how you, so the issue of institutional and informal, it's in the sense in which you understand institution, because when you go to communities, there are institutions. There's the institution, for instance, of in Isindebele we call Isipala Senkos. Yeah, it's an institution, it's a norm, it's a practice. We use that. Yes. Isipala Senkos or Zundera Mambo. Yeah, so it may not have rules in the Weberian sense or a constitution, but the community understands the rules and mechanisms of how it operates. Yes. We may also have, in Isindebele, we call it Ilima, communities coming together to help each other plant, prepare fields. There are no rules around it, but it's understood within the community. So it's an unwritten code, but it's an institution. In itself. Right. So the formality or informality in many instances refers to say, is there paperwork to do with it? But in terms of it being a formal process and recognized process within communities, it is there.
It is there.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've spoken about the characteristics that are unique to African philanthropy. Now let's talk about the challenges around finding one definition, an umbrella definition that suits all of us. What are the issues with that at the moment?
So we face a huge definitional crisis at many layers, but I'll just discuss for now the contentions around what we call philanthropy and what we do not call philanthropy. Because African philanthropy, maybe I forgot to mention this, African philanthropy as an academic field, as a field of practice, borrows from many other fields. It borrows a lot from sociology, it borrows from anthropology, and maybe the broad field of, you would put it under development studies. So it's informed by those. So these ones have been studied by others before, and we've called them forms of agency. The things I'm talking about, Amalima, Zunde, etc. These are things that we've always said, communities have agency. Communities come together to resolve problems. Now, fast forward to the African philanthropy field, everything, we now call it philanthropy.
Right.
So it creates its own challenges, because there are certain things that are actually not very, because philanthropy, another thing that we always have to remember in this discussion, is something we do voluntarily, without being coerced into it. So societal norms can actually coerce you into something, because you know that by not involved in reciprocal mechanisms, when it's your turn to need, the community will remember. The community has a long memory. They will remember that you didn't
participate.
Yeah, they know it. So they know you don't come to the labor pooling platforms like Amalima, Humo, etc. So when it comes to your turn, we always find you isolated. So if you're going into communities and you do deep dive, you begin to realize that there are certain households or families that are given certain names that actually are labels, and they are about othering them. So they're actually excluded from what communities do, based on beliefs, based on where you came from, etc., etc., and also just maybe based on gender. So those are the challenges around saying, we may put everything on the table and say this is philanthropy, but what we're doing is we're hiding dangerous practices, especially those ones that are influenced and informed by patriarchy. Because in all this, we have to be very sensitive to how patriarchy exploits women in the rural context. So in all those things, we have now to say, what then is an objective or a helpful definition of philanthropy? So for me, I always use it loosely. The things that communities do together, voluntarily. The things that are not established from the top to the bottom. So there's a challenge, for instance, with the Zunde concept. The Zunde is the chief's communal granary. The chief normally in a rural context is the top office.
Yes. So
it's a top-down thing to say you have to go and work at the Zunde of the chief. But you'll find that within similar contexts and similar communities, there are things that are being done from the ground up. So normally there we actually find that they are more active, they're actually resilient, because people are coming together out of love for what they are doing. They're not being coerced into this institution. So I'm not going to try to say, oh, this is a cleaner definition. There are many emerging scholars in this space. These are the things that they'll have to deal with. So I'm just surfacing the tensions around this space.
Okay, so looking at where we started this discussion, talking about global philanthropy and African philanthropy, you're saying African philanthropy is altruistic. We are not. It's not necessarily reciprocal, right? It's I'm giving because I want to, because I love my community, because I want, to make a difference where I am. And then juxtaposing that with global philanthropy, it's not altruistic, is it?
So the biggest philanthropist of our age in the 21st century, or maybe the second largest after Bill Gates, says this. He gives because he's got a big ego. Yeah.
But we all have some type of an ego.
Yeah, but he says his ego is big.
Okay.
So he gives big. Yeah. So he's established a network of foundations across the world, etc., etc. So if you now say, "Oh, Africans don't do that," you're totally wrong, because the billionaire class, there's also something about status and arrival. Mm-hmm. Because if you notice, the majority of the billionaire class, when they got into that, the first thing that they did was to trek to the Americas and to sign the Giving Pledge with Bill Gates. So it was about global recognition. So if you look even at the billionaire class, how it gives, the majority of them, in fact, most of them, have actually made gifts outside of Africa, to the United States, to endow a university, to fund an engineering center, and to get it named after them. So there's a lot of ego amongst the wealthy when it comes to giving. And normally, if you're a fundraiser like myself, at times you play to those egos, because that's what helps you to raise resources. So ego, I think, is a necessary driver towards philanthropy, recognition. So let's use a better term, branding. It helps to brand. Yeah. It softens, it makes more attractive, because many of the African philanthropists of this age are still active within their corporates.
Yeah.
So it helps them whenever they are getting into a country, a community, to know that if there are any needs, the foundation will handle, so that the corporate can be allowed to continue to extract value, etc., etc. So that's one side. That's where, for me, in terms of value systems, etc., they're at par. The difference, though, and it's a significant difference, the majority of philanthropists in the global north give when they've arrived. And the reason why they give, for some of us who are trying to look at the figures, the tax benefits are huge.
I was going to mention that, yeah.
Well, at least here in Africa, the only country that we know has got clear laws around giving and then tax deductible status is South Africa. The rest, you do not give because you're going to get a tax benefit. You actually get into trouble for giving, because when the tax authority learns that you have given a big gift, they think that maybe you're hiding some of your profits. So they actually
and where is the money coming from?
Exactly. So I think that's what makes our African billionaires and millionaires slightly different from their counterparts in the global north, that they are not giving because there is a tax benefit coming. They are giving because they are really concerned about what they are seeing and what they are trying to change. So that is, but when you're now talking about the community work, etc., and the altruism, I would temper altruism with understanding how societies are actually forged. Remember, I talked about that certain mechanisms that we celebrate are actually very coercive. Mm-hmm. You actually, if you do not participate, if you are sick and no one from your family comes to be part of that, most likely they may, if you were to do your own labor pooling activity, they may remember that you did not attend theirs. So you find that a parent begins to send a letter to their children in the diaspora to say, I cannot work, but if you send me money, I can send money also, etc., etc. So those are things that we have to be watchful for before we celebrate everything without understanding its attendant challenges.
Right, that's a beautiful discussion there. So as we kind of wrap this part of this series up, there's a paper that I read by Alan Fowler around the African chair of philanthropy, which I guess is the fundamentals of African philanthropy. And he talks about the nuances, the differences between naming giving as giving or as a gift, right? What are your thoughts around that? Is that important to say, no, we are looking at African philanthropy and we are terming it gifting and not giving? What are your thoughts around that?
Alan is a good friend, by the way, and he's done great work, incredible work in the space, and helped us to sort of frame this conversation, and also is an academic practice since before the time he took over the chair. So I think it's important for us to sort of understand that there are very few communities in Africa that use the term philanthropy on a day-to-day basis. it's rare. It's not part of our everyday lingua franca. So we use everyday concept like giving and gifting. So what Alan is saying is that African societies are actually established through a gifting framework. That in how we do it, it's always about exchange of gifts.
It's not self-serving.
It's not self-serving. So, and you see this. I think also the current head of the Center for African Philanthropy and Social Impact, he has talked about how we are all beneficiaries of this thing. You may call it philanthropy or the gifting framework from the time we're born until the time we're dead, with the time we die. Because at the time of your birth, many around your community will bring gifts. If different stages of your growth is associated with gifts. But these gifts are not just coming because, oh, you're so good, but they're coming because of how we do our things. Because you are also as a recipient, but you're also a giver of gifting. So it's actually what we are. It's about these interlocking, reciprocal, at different stages, forms of gifting towards each other. That's what establishes African society. I'll talk about how maybe we've sort of overemphasized it, given the penetration of capitalism, maybe in the next parts of the...
Definitely in the next one.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be quite interesting because in the next episode, we're also going to look at the evolution of African philanthropy. What was it before colonization? What did it look like during colonization? And where are we now in modern times? So any closing remarks before we go?
Yeah, I think we're hitting a nerve, and I think it's very important for us to continue with this discussion because my sense is there's a new generation of scholars, new generation of practitioners, and we risk conflation of terms. So it's very important for us to at least develop a consensus on what we mean by African philanthropy. Because what we are beginning to see, for some of us who've been in the space for a bit, we're beginning to get worried because we're putting almost everything, even NGO work, into philanthropy, etc. So I think this could be an opportune moment for us to discuss, and hopefully the podcast itself begins to kindle a discussion in places we cannot be, in platforms we are not part of, a discussion around to say, what do we really mean? So I hope we've tried to sort of tease out what we mean by African philanthropy, but I'm hoping that the next episodes that you are making reference to will help us to do that even further. Thanks.
I think it will. All right. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode where we unpacked the definition of African philanthropy and philanthropy as a whole. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Have a good one.